Rogues Gallery.
Here it is. Okay.
Okay.
So everybody, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Marini Allen. I'm the director of the Institute for Classics Education. We're a 501(c)(3) nonprofit based in the US, and our mission is to promote study of the ancient classics. With me today, I'm so excited to welcome Lynn Gordon. After being told at school that by her older brother, that she'd find Latin boring, Lynn decided to take that as a challenge rather than received wisdom and never looked back. A native of Belfast, her love of the Aeneid started in her A-level year and continued through undergraduate and postgraduate studies with her MPhil supervised by Philip Hardy. She recently decided to step back from classroom teaching to concentrate on her own research, as well as directing plays, tutoring, traveling, and generally getting up to mischief, as we know Lynn is wont to do. She has a very exciting summer planned. Those of us who are going to be in Belfast will have the pleasure of her company. But Lynn, I'm going to turn it over to you. You may tell us about your exciting achievement.
Well, I'm going to be missing out on the online summer school because my little theatre group is representing Northern Ireland at the UK finals of the one act plays. So this is shocking to me because it's the first play I've ever actually directed. And we keep looking at each other going, how did that actually happen? So we will undoubtedly come last, but we're going to have a good time while we're doing it. So, hey, but I will be there, as Rini said, for the in-person one. So, right. Am I to start now, Rini?
Get us going.
Okay, let's go. All righty. So I'm just going to reduce this to here and move you up to here. And hopefully you can all see the screen here and you can hear me. This is a title which, Linda, you were in on the ground floor of this. So this is another version of what I spoke about in Durham. So apologies if some of the same ground has gone over again. I've called it Rearticulating Virgil's Women because I am going to be looking at Dido, Camilla, and Lavinia, as it says there, in an epic medieval afterlife, which sounds tremendously exciting, but it is for people like me. I'm going to start with a question. When is a
Lynn, we
translation?
can see you, but we can't see any
Oh.
thing.
Okay, I have. That's probably because I haven't done this.
Thank you, Linda.
There we go. Thanks, Linda. As ever, my technological skills definitely do know a barrier. So, I'm going to start with a question. When is a translation not a translation? And to save us a lot of time and roundabout way, I'll answer it for you. It's when it is a vernacularization. Now, that is a word I have practiced saying many times because I'm going to be using it a lot this afternoon. Vernacularizations are the ultimate vehicle to express fresh explorations and ideas and to offer a reflection on what matters most to both the writer and, probably most importantly, to his audience. They say less, I think, about the ancient source material itself and much more about how a particular society chose to view that source, how they viewed themselves and their world as it is reflected within the text. That's why 12th century vernacularizations of ancient texts are so particularly intriguing. Given the tumultuous times throughout Europe and beyond in which they were produced, it seems that contemporary writers often found there a safe space within which they could play with concepts and ideas and consider securely what wider possibilities they could offer. Just to give us a little bit of context here, I'm going to look at three key events in the 12th century. which give a sense of a period of extended political chaos and cultural shift, which was the hallmark of this particular century. First of all, there's the anarchy from 1135 to 1158, which is really a particularly dramatic name for an extended war of succession for the throne of England between Matilda, who was the only legitimate child of Henry I, and her cousin, Stephen of Blois. Even by medieval standards, this was a particularly vicious and destructive conflict, which resulted in a widespread breakdown of law and order. Despite mounting a considerable challenge to assert her legitimate claim to the throne, Matilda in the end did not triumph, at least not on her own account. But she did ensure that her eldest son would ultimately succeed Stephen as king. And so in 1154, Henry II, Matilda's eldest child, was crowned king not just of England, but of an extensive Angevin empire within France. Women also played a significant role in the second event I'm focusing on, the Second Crusade. Melisende was Queen of Jerusalem, and she had led in person her army out in defence of her own territory and had mounted an appeal to the Pope for help. Also, Eleanor of Aquitaine travelled to the Holy Land to join in with this crusade with her first husband, Louis VII of France. And she was accompanied on that trip by her own particular vassal lords. Eleanor had her own ideas on tactics and strategy, and she was unafraid to voice them and, in fact, act on them. And such was her impact that she was regularly the subject of malicious gossip, accused of having an affair with her own uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, while on crusade, and it's no real surprise that her marriage fell apart on the journey home. The legend of Eleanor as a glamorous, free-thinking, dangerous woman on the loose was now set in stone, and it was consolidated further when she fled from prospective French suitors to make her own choice of second husband, none other than Henry II, Matilda's eldest son. Finally, we have, and being me, I couldn't not mention the Norman conquest of Ireland, which we know started on the 1st of May 1169, an anniversary coming up there. Richard de Clare, with Henry II's sanction, helped Dermot MacMurrough to regain the key kingdom of Leinster. And after he did that, he then married Aoife, Dermot's daughter, who became the matriarch, if you like, of the Anglo-Irish. This domestic squabble over Leinster gave Henry the pretext he long had wanted to invade Ireland, imposing conformity with England in both law and religious practice. So it's into this world of violent flux that we find a desire amongst medieval rulers to root and therefore legitimise their genealogy and models of empire in the ancient prehistory of Europe. At the same time, we can also see an emergence of vernacularizations of the Aeneid during this period, along with a shift from an epic format to that of romance. This shift allows space for different emergent powers to expand and give voice to actual or potential societal change. So what emerges here is a cultural and societal flashpoint, if you like. A literary and political community trying to legitimise its sense of power and potential within a society or literature configured in its ancient and therefore male-dominated epic tradition. For all their deep roots and intricate conversations with their shared Latin source, vernacularizations can be seen to express fresh concepts of feminine will and power, which challenge the old social models of a purely male militant aristocracy. Now, I want to show this afternoon how these new incarnations of the Aeneid reflect changing attitudes to feminine power amongst women themselves. not just their male society. For it is in the changes and transformations accompanying these vernacularizations that we can see the writer's intent to represent concepts or aspirations of contemporary female power through examples of ancient epic women, by which they can remove the impact to a world seen and acknowledged as ancient and therefore other. And we see this most clearly articulated in how the writers present and reinterpret the characters of Dido, Camilla, and Lavinia. I intend to look at how this is done mainly in the Roman d'Aeneas, as it is the most substantial and complete of these vernacularizations, and then examine the possible connections between this anonymous French roman and Irish heroic shale, particularly the Imtheachta Aeniasa, as well as the Irish equivalent of the French roman called romantia. Finally, I'd like to consider what this might imply for both the afterlife of these Virgilian women and feminine presence within medieval literary and political contexts. Although the Roman d'Aeneas, like its Roman model, is not just a straightforward hymn to imperial conquest and patriarchal structure, the writer of the Roman d'Aeneas is perhaps aiming for something a little different. Through adapting and, in some cases, amplifying Virgil's female characters and thus reorganising the essential structure of the Aeneid around them, and effectively, if you want to look at it this way, turning the Aeneid inside out. They are incorporating the competing subversive powers of feminine eroticism and feminine models of independent power and agency. And they can look at the heroic world from the other side of the gender divide. The Roman d'Aeneas seems almost to present a manual for women, I think, showing them the pitfalls of negotiating their status and relationships, but also giving them a possible path to agency in both areas. So the Roman d'Aeneas begins with Dido's backstory in much the same way as Virgil does, with the murder of her husband Sichaeus by her brother. There is, however, one significant difference. Virgil tells us that Pygmalion's motivation for killing was a blind love of gold, auri caecus amor. But in the Roman d'Aeneas, it is the desire for political power specifically, which is behind the deed. The focus of the narrative in both versions moves swiftly onto Sichaeus' exiled, powerless widow, Dido, except that, as we know, she is anything but powerless. Whereas Virgil prefers to give the reader more detail about Dido's situation in Tyre and her plans to escape, focusing rather on her fears and her tears, with only a brief statement that she'd bought the Byrsa from her new African neighbours. The Roman d'Aeneas is much more interested in exactly how Dido came to get her hands on the land by outsmarting, which I can nearly say, the prince of the territory. And you can see the particular passage there on the screen. I am not going to inflict my pronunciation of medieval French on you, but you can see what's written there. She arrived in this land and she went to the prince of the country. With great cleverness, she went to ask him if he would sell her as much of the land as the hide of a bull would enclose, and she gave him gold and silver for it. The prince, not suspecting a trick, granted it to her. Dido cut the hide into very thin strips. With these she took so much land that she founded a city there. Then she conquered so much by her wealth, by her cleverness, and by her prowess, that she possessed the whole country, and the barons submitted to her. Dido's key attribute, according to the Roman d'Aeneas, is not her beauty. It's not even her wealth. Well, it's not exactly hers anyway. But it's her engin, which I've highlighted in the passage, which translates in many different ways, a bit like metis in Greek, as skill, cleverness, that sort of area. It's mentioned 3 times in the passage on the screen to underline its crucial importance to her as a characteristic. Thus, the medieval writer even opens up space in Virgil's narrative for the story of Dido making space for herself, literally and politically, in the African prince's territory. The writer also lays out for the reader the contrast in how men and women can gain power. Whereas Dido's brother seizes it through violence and threats, Dido herself uses her engin, her cleverness, instead to obtain the submission of the local barons. Furthermore, whereas Virgil describes Carthage itself as dives opum studiisque asperima belli, rich in resources and most bitter in the pursuit of war, the picture of Carthage provided in the Roman Aeneas is certainly dives opum, but in terms of it being studiis asperima belli, there is another shift of perspective. While it is true that the French version of Carthage is indeed an amazingly devised military structure, it becomes very clear that the function of these impressive structures is entirely defensive. The city lies behind elaborate fortifications with impenetrable marble walls, made par grand engin, by great cleverness, as they point out in line 424, thus connecting them firmly with Dido herself through her key characteristic. They're fitted with huge magnets which hold fast any armoured aggressor. So we can see that the actual construction of Carthage is in the image of feminine power. It's not aggressive, it's protective, and it's very much in accord with the use of engin rather than force to gain power and control. Within the walls of Carthage, the writer shows an obsession with huge numbers when describing the interior. There's 500 towers, 100 colours of marble, 200 arches on the Capitol, which gives eloquent voice to the scale of the unnerving power accrued by Dido, reminding the reader of the engin necessary in Carthage's queen not only to acquire the land on which this is all built, but also to construct the city and its defences, as well as to fund it with trade, Carthage's primary economic activity, and one which relies, of course, on engin for success. Therefore, the writer of the Roman Aeneas wants to go further with his presentation of Dido as an ideal ruler than Virgil does. What Dido acquires comes from her own engin. What she builds reflects that, articulating clearly what can be achieved when a ruler employs a more feminized skill set, even in a patriarchal political and economic context. Dido's engin and growing feminine power is constantly linked to her city's status and wealth. Carthage looks different and behaves in a different way to other male-constructed models of civic life because of this. This perhaps then makes better sense than in the original Latin epic of Dido's decision to construct a temple to Juno, the personification of feminine power, in the centre of her city. The writer tells us that she makes it riche à démesure, rich beyond measure. Given her great wealth, the opulence of the temple would hardly come as any surprise to the reader. But démesure suggests excess, something beyond the normal limits. If patriarchal imperial rule, the societal norm both in Roman and in medieval European worlds, is associated with measure, containment, and the keeping of limits, then perhaps we can see this tone of excess as part of a broader pattern amongst Virgil's mortal women in the Roman Aeneas. They all form a threat, in each case, to mesure, by performing a role which is excessive and beyond accepted gender norms. And this makes them the very definition of démesure. It's the lure of this dangerously seductive démesure in terms of wealth and power, which is articulated in the city, its patron and its queen, which threatens both the inherently aggressive imperial military ethos of the Trojans and their leader Aeneas in particular. If Dido's power finds visual representation in terms of her city's mercantile splendour, the material results of her cleverness, then she presents her erotic challenge to Aeneas in the same terms. As we can see on the screen, her first attempt to seduce Aeneas involves her showing off the city she's built from her own engin. She takes the Trojan by the hand, uncertain as yet of her love, and leads him through the city, showing him her wealth, her castle, and her palace. However, to flourish, engin needs flexibility. And it is Dido's ability to change and choose for herself, which, when combined with the wealth and power which engin brings, leads to démesure, and ultimately will lead to her fall. Dido might appear to be exercising choice, not only in her decision to turn away from mourning her dead husband and embracing her desire for Aeneas, but also in her shift from the exercise of civic power to erotic surrender. But the writer of the Roman d'Aeneas wants us to see that her willingness to go against her logical engin, which has served her so well in the past, and inhabit the emotional territory of amour, in fact restricts, if not actually removes, her ability to choose. We need only examine the language of the actual sexual encounter between Dido and Aeneas in the cave to appreciate how this undermines the apparent free exercise of female desire. And you can see this very, very telling retelling of the cave episode on the screen. Behold the two of them together and alone now. He took his will of her without much force, and she hardly refused him, consenting to his desire, just what she'd wanted all along. Here we see them both together, and for once utterly alone. So there's no need for any performative action for any specific audience. It is significant, I think, that at this point, male force comes up against female volonté, or will. We should note that force precedes volonté in the text and seems almost to obviate it. The writer says that Aeneas doesn't use too much force. This implies strongly that some force indeed was present here. A very different picture from that of the same scene in the Aeneid, where Aeneas appears to be a rather passive lover, content to let Dido take the initiative. The roles here are now clearly reversed, as Aeneas here does make a sexual decision, which renders Dido's willing desire completely unnecessary or even superfluous. The initial choice is his, and all it is left to Dido to do is to succumb.
The clutch broke. Yeah.
Sorry, you okay then?
Yeah, I'm just gonna.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like Levine later in the Roman d'Aeneas, Dido does have desire. Interestingly, she's as surprised by this as Levine is. And she does have agency of a kind, but it is an agency which is preempted and effectively rendered pointless by a prior male decision. The reality is, of course, that the choice she is offered, ironically by a woman, her sister Anna, is no choice at all, as it turns out. By choosing Aeneas, she appears to be choosing life and the possibility of having it all, as they used to say in the 80s. But this choice instead leads her to death, the death of her reputation, her independence, and her power. Indeed, it eventually takes her to a situation where her only option is suicide. Earlier in her discussion with Anna, we see Dido as being boxed in to her fidelity to Zacchaeus, despite her apparent freedom and agency. She, in fact, feels constrained by a closed system of patriarchal power. By choosing Aeneas, Dido thinks she is articulating her power to self-determination, but she simply swaps one model of patriarchal power for another. It might be more accurate, maybe, to say that it is in fact the same model, marriage or a relationship, just with different proponents of male authority. This is a lesson which the writer of the Roman d'Aeneas really wants the reader to observe carefully. That patriarchal controls on women can work in deceptive ways. Dido's independence in action, her choice in decision-making as a female ruler, comes from her escape from controlling men, whether it's a husband, a brother, or local baron. And it gives her the perfect arena in which to exercise the engin, which makes her such an effective and successful agent in the politics of gender and power. However, once Dido chooses to express emotions and desire, all her subsequent choices are governed by a willing surrender of everything which gives her agency to a situation where her will and her choice is only secondary to a man's force and decision. The reaction of the surrounding barons to Dido's choice in the Roman d'Aeneas offers another subtle but key development from the Aeneid source. In Virgil's version, only Iarbas complains about her behaviour, and he does so to his father Jupiter, who then sends Mercury to get Aeneas back on track. In the Roman d'Aeneas, however, male hostility to Dido is much broader and more corporate, as we can see on the screen. When the barons hear what's being said, the dukes, princes, counts, whom she was previously unwilling to take as her lord, consider themselves very much shamed, since she has completely rejected them for a man of the lowest status, who was neither a count nor a king. Amongst themselves they say, and they are right, that it is only a great fool who believes a woman. She doesn't keep her word. Such a woman considers wise what is foolish. Foolish is anyone who trusts in a woman. So the main theme of the barons' complaints against Dido is not so much moral disgust at her behaviour as their constant reference to Dido breaking her promises, not just to Zacchaeus, but to them and, worse still, to her own people, thus breaking a kind of feudal pledge, which they suggest is something that no male ruler would ever do. This then, in the Roman d'Aeneas, is Dido's central challenge to the male notion of order. It is the danger which Dido, or any woman who tries to exercise power in a way different from accepted male norms, poses to the notion of possession and fidelity in every sense, and her replacement of feudal links of order and obligation to the community with private and flexible choices, which bothers the barons, not her sexual morality at all. To neutralise such a potent threat, it must be contained. Yet this can only be achieved after Dido's death, when she's buried. And again, there is a large departure from the source Aeneid here. For not only do the barons contain Dido's ashes within a very small urn, they then place the very small urn within a large and elaborate tomb, whose enamelling and inlay seems deliberately to recall the decorations on Aeneas's sword and scabbard. And although Dido, in her final speech, speaks her own epitaph, as in the Aeneid, although it is defiantly different in tone from the Virgilian source. She grants Aeneas forgiveness in the French version, rather than call down eternal enmity on his descendants, as in the Aeneid. But the men who seek to control and contain her memorialization impose a second epitaph on her tomb, engraved on the tomb that they hope can contain her. And we can see the full epitaph on the screen. The words say, "Here lies Dido, who took her own life because of love. Never was there a better pagan, if only she had not known such solitary love, and had not loved so recklessly. Her wisdom was worthless to her." It's worth looking at the official epitaph in full for two interesting points. Firstly, we should note how carefully how often the inscription defines Dido in terms of being a victim of love. The men who wrote it appear to be making the point that the savoir, which brought so much good to her people, was wasted on her because of her erotic obsession with Aeneas. But as the winners in Dido's story, they are making a valiant attempt to control Dido's narrative and memorialization after her death. Thus, they make her conform, finally, to the rules of gender roles and the exercise of power, and give a clear example to any other women who might try to escape their confines. Secondly, Dido is referred to in the epitaph as païenne, which I've translated as pagan, but we could also translate as heathen. This single word takes her out of her ancient context and places her firmly in a contemporary 12th century landscape. So, this epitaph is clearly written for the medieval present and those reading it in that time, and therefore it must mean that we are meant by the writer to see her as a somehow timeless figure, suspended in time, both contained by her source, like her tomb, and clearly liberated from it, as an existing real presence for all time. And after all, what could be more exceptional in a Christianized, paternalistic literary landscape than a smart, independent, powerful, and pagan woman? The final containment of Dido in her little urn, along with her anachronistic epitaph, clearly sets a pattern for how the writer of the Roman Aeneas tries to negotiate female power through strategies of either reduction, containment, or marginalisation. It's perhaps no accident that Dido and Levine appear at opposite ends of the poem, at its margins, if you like, as they both deal with the same issues: love for Aeneas and their status within both societal and sexual relationships. They do so in different ways, and it's true, with different outcomes. That said, this device places them as far away as possible from the central military struggle between Aeneas and Turnus, the central action of the Roman Aeneas. The bulk of the Roman Aeneas, around 6,000 lines between the Dido and Levine episodes, deal with a war of imperial conquest between the Trojans and the Latins, which, at a stroke, shifts the perfect balance of the original Aeneid's 12 books, 6 Odyssean, 6 Iliadic, all about Aeneas, to what is basically a feudal struggle for the possession of land and a woman, as opposed to being about arms and a man. Bookended by two female negotiations of power and position, pivoting around a female warrior who rejects conventional eroticism and gender roles to take on one of the great themes of patriarchy, militant aristocracy, and that figure is Camille, the warrior princess. Camille's challenge is, however, militant rather than sexual, as Dido's was and Levine's will be. And she therefore gains the admiration, however grudging or uncomfortable, of the males who observe her. It's significant that the incongruity of Camille's role, her arena is the battlefield, not the bed, is articulated by Tarchon, as we can see on the screen here, the rather unpleasant leader of the Trojans' allies, in a speech where he clearly voices the medieval male fear of feminine démesure. Calm this excessiveness. Put down that shield and the lance and the hauberk, which hurts you too much, and do not show your prowess. This is not your profession, but spinning, sewing, and cutting are. A young woman makes a better battle in a nice bedchamber behind the bed curtain. Tarchon basically tells Camille to stick to a woman's work, and comments that even if he could persuade Camille to leave the battlefield by paying her gold, her sexual veracity is such that she will take on 100 of his men and still not be satisfied. These links between female sexual power and démesure, or excess, are made by a male character, and in such a way that recalls not just Dido and Carthage, but also, historically, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was regularly accused not just of sexual veracity, but also of going beyond what was acceptable for a woman in terms of her role as queen. Camille manages to combine kingship and queenship in a single figure, which is much more of a threat because she appears so self-sufficient. And in reality, despite what Tarchon says, she is not affected by any erotic weakness as Dido has been. Again, we might find a contemporary resonance here in the idea of a woman who was also a ruler was such an anathema in the case of Matilda that her barons broke the oath that they swore to her father Henry I before his death to support her most legitimate claim to the English throne. Medieval chroniclers regularly lament Matilda's lack of femininity and complain of her mannishness, ironically something also fired at Eleanor. Yet Camilla, or Camille as she is here, represents a real danger to the existing aristocratic order, as well as to the historical destiny of the male characters in the Roman Aeneas. And as our story unfolds, they respond to this feminine danger as they did with Dido, by enclosing and inscribing her within a tomb. Even more impossibly elaborate, if that were even possible, than Dido's. The most striking feature of her tomb is a series of concentric circles expanding at each level above a decorated pillar, which is topped by a weirdly miraculous mirror, which shows all enemies as they approach the tomb. This is probably the Roman Aeneas's best example of a technological construction, striving both to constrain a female threat while suspending her somehow in time. Camille, through the mirror, gives the appearance of still being on the lookout for potential threats, even though she is in fact dead and neither help nor threat to anybody. Camille's epitaph, also written by men, ironically encodes the perfect values of militant male aristocracy. She gave herself to the bearing of arms, and by arms she was killed beneath La Honte. However, as with Dido, this kind of praise can only be given to Camille once she's actually safely dead, and her real threat to the existing male order is over. It could be argued that a tomb so ingeniously constructed and with such a fulsome epitaph might suggest some kind of permanence and effective memorialization of Camille's presence. But a closer examination shows that the tomb's architecture is precariously balanced on one single pillar, and a lamp suspended by a single chain, which is to burn forever apparently, can in fact be wrecked by even the slightest touch. sending it crashing back into the past in oblivion. So Camille's elaborate memorialization, created by the men whom she challenges, can only, at best, be conditional and inherently flawed. As we now turn towards Lavinia, the writer of the Roman d'Aeneas most pointedly departs from the source Aeneid. We immediately see a very bold innovation. The writer has invented an actual character for Lavinia and an elaborate romantic involvement between herself and Aeneas. Not only that, but the writer has also given her an actual voice and a will of her own, which she enjoys exercising at every possible opportunity, as well as, unexpectedly, for the reader as much as for Lavinia herself, I suspect, strong sexual feelings. In this version of the Aeneid, Lavigne becomes the central female character of the later part of the poem, acting as a counterbalance to the doomed relationship with Dido in the first half. Lavigne and Aeneas fall in love at first sight, and it's important to her that this love goes beyond the merely lustful liaison he enjoyed with Dido. Aeneas, on his part, finds that true love that he has found in Lavigne gives him the strength and motivation he needs to win the war against her former fiancé Turnus. Ah, romance. All the male-female characters in the Roman d'Aeneas, Dido, Camille and Lavigne, are stabilised by imposed stasis and containment. Dido and Camille are stabilised within their tombs, and Lavigne, after a punishment inflicted on her by her mother for refusing to marry Turnus, is imprisoned within a tower. There is a significant difference, however, between them. Unlike Dido and Camille, Lavigne escapes from her containment and goes on to achieve not just her aim in fulfilling her love for Aeneas, on her own emotional terms as much as on her father's political ones, but also in playing a significant role in enabling the nascent new regime of Aeneas. The writer of the Roman d'Aeneas creates a completely non-Virgilian Lavigne in a scene with her mother, who is never named. And she wants to ensure that Lavigne marries Turnus and pursues that agenda by asking her daughter if she has yet learned about love and its tricks. And you can see the quotation there from the speech on the screen. My goodness, you're of such an age that you really ought to know quite well about love and its tricks and sneaky deeds. It is worth noting that Lavigne's mother uses the word engin here, which has such close links with Dido, and goes on to describe the god Amors with his twin arrows tipped with gold and lead. Here is another connection with Dido. She carries golden arrows on her hunt with Aeneas when her love for him is growing. Furthermore, when Dido dies, it is by piercing herself sos la mamelle beneath her breast. Indeed, Camille is also killed by an arrow, which hits her, yes, sos la mamelle, beneath her breast. And now we see that Lavigne too is figuratively going to be struck by one of Amor's arrows, d'ici quel cœur sos la mamelle, as deep as the heart beneath her breast. The connection between the three women is therefore clearly flagged up by the writer. But as the Lavigne episode continues, we also become aware that although Lavigne is in danger of becoming confined, like Dido and Camilla, she manages to negotiate through a combination of engin, volonté, and savoir, characteristics which all three women have, but only Lavigne combines all three in one person. And she does this to escape her fate. Lavigne's emerging desire and growing sense of self in opposition to what her mother insists her gender-based societal role should be, both aligns her with her father, the source of patriarchal power and self-determination, in an echo of Henry I's decision to promote his daughter Matilda as his heir, and against her mother. Ironically, it is the feminine arena of love that pulls her into the male world of war and politics. This has previously been viewed as a threat to Aeneas's destiny, but now it becomes a catalyst to enabling its success. As if to highlight this point more strongly, Lavigne and her mother then engage in a long, learned debate, at the end of which Lavigne finally admits to her love for Aeneas in a kind of acrostic division of his name into syllables. Thus, Lavigne's rejection of her mother's domination is announced, not just thought about or even just written down. In a moment of specifically verbal, you might even say pedagogical play, showing Lavigne choosing to talk about love in the context of learned activity. Hardly a typical arena for a girl. This masculine approach is further emphasised when she decides to announce her love to Aeneas herself. She writes him a letter, explicitly said to be in Latin. And in addition, Lavigne sends her letter to Aeneas by an arrow. There's that image again. And while it is true that she does not actually fire the arrow herself, she gets a handy archer to do it for her. Lavigne is clearly very much focused and in charge of the whole operation. So the writer of the Roman d'Aeneas takes an image, an arrow, which has previously been an instrument of containment for women in the poem, and by assuming control over how that image is aimed and used, acquires agency over her own feelings and indeed over her own future. Not only that, but Lavigne's usurpation of this arrow image and her use of argument and Latin in her letter to Aeneas also initiates Aeneas's love for her and his sense of erotic suffering. This is normally the province of females, but this is its first appearance as a male characteristic, highlighting the subtle gender role reversal at play between Lavigne and Aeneas. Lavigne has also managed to escape her tower, metaphorically and ultimately physically too, by taking over the symbol of both desire and warfare and making it work for her as a woman with agency. Lavigne has a further debate at lines 8676, 8774, which I did not put up there, I think, in which she considers this time internally whether she should let Aeneas know how she feels. Societal norms would suggest that Lavigne should hide her feelings, let the battle between Aeneas and Turnus decide her preference. So Lavigne would be expected to show modest discretion, preserve her value in the market of marriage and lineage, and let herself be the prize of an exclusively male debate, to hide, if not actually deny, her agency and will. But Lavigne does not choose to do this. The final dominant voice in this internal debate speaks for the claims of feminine agency, with Lavigne even stating that the exercise of her will in communicating directly with Aeneas will in fact make him stronger for the upcoming battle, thus linking herself directly to a claim to aid the ends of the Trojan military conquest. Female agency, therefore, makes its final argument through the newly re-articulated character of Lavigne. In the context of a male arena, it insists on action rather than passivity and on being a vital element in bringing Trojan destiny into political reality. So, unlike Dido and Camille, whose quests for independent power, love, or self-determination have ended in destruction and containment of the threat they posed to patriarchal norms, Lavigne's love, articulated by a combination of Dido's engin and Camille's volonté, plus her own evolved intellectual savoir, actually enable Aeneas's development of new imperial structures, which may attempt to preserve the hierarchy of male power, but cannot, in fact, come into being and thus bring in a new unified future for Trojans and Italians alike, without strong female agency. Given that the probable date of composition for the Roman d'Aeneas is around 1160, it's easy to see that the historical context might well be interesting here. Given how the writer seems to foreground Dido, Camille and Levine, it's tempting to think that we're being asked to consider, especially in Levine's case, how women might make a valuable contribution in negotiating power and politics, alongside, not instead of, their male characters. Even a surface knowledge of the stories of Matilda and Eleanor of Aquitaine would show how neatly they are reflected in Dido's flight from her brother and her trolling, if you like, by jealous men for her apparent sexual laxity, Camille's skill in fighting a battle she cannot win, and finally Levine's clever use of skill and free will to gain a significant foothold in the forefront of her own political context. We don't know who wrote the Roman d'Aeneas, but I'd like to ask the question, might it not be possible to have been a woman who was writing for other women? We know that Eleanor was highly educated, as was Matilda, and was a keen patroness of the arts. There would surely have been an audience for such a reworking of what is the ultimate male epic, turning it inside out to see what happens when you put women at the forefront. Along with heroic Sgéil, which chronicle the lives and battles of various heroes in Irish mythology, like Fergus and Cuchulainn, there also seems to have been a fascination with ancient epics in 12th century Irish literature written at the same time as the Roman d'Aeneas. The Book of Ballymote, which contains one of only 3 manuscripts of the Imtheachta Aeniasa, or the Journeys of Aeneas, provides us with vernacularizations not just of the Aeneid, but also of the Odyssey, the life of Alexander the Great, and the labours of Hercules. And there are also Irish versions of Statius's Achillead, and Thebaid, and Lucan's Pharsalia. Presumably the audience for such vernacularizations was much the same as on mainland Europe. Men and women looking for history, entertainment, or a reflection of their own world in the literature of the past, accessibly available in their own language. The primary emphasis in such works is nothing more complex than a record of violent deeds done to emphasize the heroic status of the protagonists at whatever cost. So we tend to find ancient stories retold almost literally, with little adaptation or change in structure or characterization within the Irish medium. But the Imtheachta Aeniasa is slightly different. It's the only such Irish vernacularization to deal with female characters in detail and without prejudice. Dido gets very little direct condemnation for her affair. But then of course this is a society which afforded high status women much more freedom in legal and social terms than might have been the case elsewhere, especially in marriage. And there was a pattern of royal women in earlier Irish myth and Sgéil who were sexually powerful and unafraid to take the lead with the men they desired. People like Maeve, who leads the men of Connaught in the cattle-raided Cooley, had at least 5 recognised husbands and many, many, many more lovers, usually of her own choosing. Camilla's exploits are also recorded in the Imtheachta with approval as a brave warrior regardless of gender, and she is given the same respect for showing the same savagery in battle as her male counterparts. Again, there is a pattern for this in early Irish native mythology, with Scacha, the warrior woman who trains Cuchulainn to be the greatest of all heroes and gives him secret military techniques which help him defeat Maeve of Connaught. Furthermore, the construction of Lavinia in the Imtheachta Aeniasa reflects that of Lavine in the Roman d'Aeneas more closely than that of the Aeneid, while incorporating elements of Emer, the wife of Cuchulainn, who is also won through combat and a woman very keen to show her own agency in decisions affecting her future. In so many respects, then, it is tempting to make a case for linking the Imtheachta Aeniasa to the Roman d'Aeneas. It's possible, on a reasonable linguistic analysis, to date the Irish in the Book of Ballymote to around the middle of the 12th century, which would certainly place it in the same time frame as the Roman d'Aeneas. However, the approach to the narrative is subtly different. Whereas there's a clear thematic and ideological slant to the Roman d'Aeneas, such a reading of the Imtheachta Aeniasa would be difficult to sustain, if I'm honest, as the anonymous writer is primarily interested in simply presenting the events of Aeneas's wanderings as a sequence of interesting, heroic and bloodthirsty events. The Dido episode is then unusual in that it is very detailed, and the focus does shift away from the central male character, as in the Roman d'Aeneas, and possibly with further and more complex analysis, we could pin down some closer correspondences. However, the area which I think is the most promising in linking Irish and French vernacularizations of the Aeneid is through earlier Scal. In the various cycles of Irish heroic epics, we regularly see strong women who act and speak in a way very similar to Dido, Camille, and Lavine in both the Latin source and in the Roman d'Aeneas. We can even group them into 4 broad categories: queen, wife, lover, female warrior, which makes me think that there might be some connection at an earlier date. That female characterization in early medieval Irish writing may well have been influenced by Virgil's original epic, and then in turn provided some influence on the writers of romans like the Roman d'Aeneas. Irish priests and scholars regularly travelled to and from France in this period. We know that there was a classical curriculum in places of learning in Ireland, like Glendalough. The bare bones of a complex system of links may well be there, but it will take time, patience, and probably funding to actually tease them out. What we can say, however, in conclusion, is this: that it is quite possible that an educated, high-status woman at a French court may well have taken up her copy of the Aeneid, or even her Irish priest's Imtheachta Aeniasa, and reworked it in such a way that it reflected not just the world she knew historically, but also another world of her imagination, where women could wield power in their own way, articulated by un genre of volonté, and which would actually enable an evolvement of amour courtois, or courtly love, into something which could develop into a viable partnership with female agency and action. Whoever she was, our medieval vernacularizer gave Virgil's women a truly new lease of life. And that is me done. I have a bibliography there, which if anybody wants to have a read at it, I'm happy to send out to them. But I'm not quite sure that any of you will want to after that little range of things. But that's me done. So any questions anybody would like to ask, more than happy to answer.
Thank you, Lynn. That was really fascinating. I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we can take any questions that people have. So thank you very much. And anyone who's watching this later is welcome also to put questions.